Good morning, and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and the goal of our show is to explore a wide range of topics that challenge us to see ourselves, our community, and the world around us in ways that get us thinking, get us talking, get us imagining, get us reflecting, and perhaps connected. Because we've been challenged to do just a bit more because we're making those connections. Our topic today is a journey of faith in community. And hosting with me is Rick Bernardo. And Rick has brought a guest to journey with us as we talk about his journey in faith and community.
Yeah, and I started a major part of my journey with our guest, Don Dewey, Reverend Don Dewey, to be a little more formal, which I hardly ever am with him. And I'm just going to say a little bit, and then, Don, I want you to say something, and then I'll say a little more about you. So Don Dewey and his spouse, Susan, each received their Master of Divinity degrees from Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, where I also was their classmate. And Don and Susan both were ordained into the Christian Church, also known as Disciples of Christ, in the 1980s. And Don, say hi. Wave.
Hi.
Something. All
Good
right.
to be with you.
Thank you. Yeah, good to see you. So, and after 35 years in ministry, serving congregations in El Sobrante, La Mesa, and Ventura, California, then as co-regional ministers of the Pacific Southwest region of the Christian Church or Disciples of Christ, they were in that path from 2007 to 2019. Then Don and Susan retired, sort of. In the fall of 2021 and through the spring of 2022, they were both interim pastors for two disciple congregations in Hawaii, yay. And then since September of last year, they've been interim co-pastors at First Christian Church of Torrance. That's in California, and they've been married for 42 years. They have 2 children and 3 grandsons, and we have Don with us. So say again, hi.
Hi.
Welcome, Don. We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
So the two of you met when you were both in a seminary.
Yeah, it was.
And was that your intention also to become a minister? Was that your intention of going to seminary, Rick?
Me? No,
Yeah.
no. The running distinction that is actually sort of a joke between Don and I is I was just an MA, and he was an MDiv. We were on those paths. Personally, I was always clear I did not want to be ordained. Nothing against that, but I just saw my calling as to support people like Don, but not be in that place. One of the themes on our Connections radio show is the humanized ministry, which is probably why I didn't want to be a minister, because it's really it's way harder than it looks. Don, you could chime in on this.
Well, sometimes it is harder than it looks.
And you went for your Master's of Divinity. And
Yeah.
Tell me about your calling to be part of the ministry.
Well, it was a journey itself. I grew up as a preacher's kid. My dad was a disciple pastor for over 40-some years. And, growing up, there's goods and bads about being a preacher's kid. The good is, you got a lot of people who pay attention to you when you're young. As you get a little older, you start to feel that you're a little bit different than others. People have expectations of preacher's kids that they don't necessarily have of regular kids. So that was a journey. And so after high school and into early college, I think ministry was the last thing I really wanted to do. I'd see both the good and the bad about that. But God had a different plan, and I found my way into seminary, and I have felt that that's where I needed to be, and it has been a good and challenging experience.
So tell me about your experiences, Rick.
Well, I was going to basically resonate with what Don was saying. We find our ways. I mean, it's not all set like I'm this, and whatever the image of our calling, whatever we feel we're born to be, if we're lucky enough to even have a sense of calling, a lot of people, it takes a lifetime to get that. It's not always going to be what we thought it was going to be. And Don, I've told our listeners before that Pacifica School of Religion, the Graduate Theological Union, being in Berkeley, I spent only 5 years in my 3-year program. And the whole time it was like being inside the MASH television show, good people doing amazing, good work with a good amount of partying and cross-dressing. And it was that we had other guests from PSR here with us, and it was that zany at times and that rubber meets the road kind of committed to ministry.
And you told me you had some stories too.
Don, you let me know, but there's all kinds of examples. I only share them just, again, to humanize this is what it was like, and there was a joy to this is why I have you on the show, Don. You carry a joy with you, and everybody in your family does. And no matter what happens, it's there for you, I can see. But there was one time Don was visiting after we graduated. I stayed in Berkeley. He was off doing ministry all over the place. And we were walking down Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and that's the busiest neighborhood probably in the country. And we approached a limousine that was probably 2 blocks long in front of one of the well-known bars in Berkeley. And we're walking, and Don walks up to the chauffeur standing very formally dressed in front of this limousine. And Don starts talking to him, saying, "I'm so sorry. We're late. It'll never happen again. Where are we going today?" The chauffeur fell on the ground laughing, and he was so tickled like that he gave us 2 tickets to what he was waiting for the people inside the bar. It was a special Budweiser girls event or something. There was dancing inside. So we went inside, and it was this scene we didn't expect to have that day. Exactly. So anyway, he's playful. And I know.
And do you have some special memories of that time? It's kind of a crazy time. It was the late 70s, early 80s, right?
Yeah, I wanted to say that, yeah.
I think there was a lot of leftovers from the 60s still in Berkeley. Berkeley was sort of the heartbeat of the 60s and all of that. And even by the late 70s, there was still a lot of that around, walking across Cal campus. There was always protesting or all kinds of interesting and kind of crazy things going on. I think Berkeley at the time, like on Telegraph, you could walk down Telegraph Road and you could probably see almost every kind of person you could imagine there. From
celebration of multicultural.
Even beyond multicultural, this was. They were wild. It was a fun time.
Yeah, I would run into Wavy Gravy now and then. And, I remember him saying to me, "Look, man, if you don't have a sense of humor, it's not even funny." But also, tell us a little of your story. You and I helped with some Bread and Roses nonprofit events through our colleagues. Alan Clausen, we're going to have on our program soon, but he helped organize some amazing charity events overlooking the San Francisco Bay at the Greek Theater with the likes of Crosby's and Nash and Robin Williams and all kinds of famous people. So any memories of that? I just wanted to pick your brain.
Yeah. Alan and I started a coffee house in the basement of I think a United Church of Christ church, and it was involving musicians around the Bay Area. And of course, in the Bay Area, there were plenty of those. And we had everything from belly dancers to comedians to musical groups of all stripes. And one of those happened to be Mimi Farina, who was the sister of Joan Baez. And it was Mimi Farina who had organized Bread and Roses, which was a musical weekend concert that brought top musicians from all over to perform, and was a fundraiser to support activities and music venues in children's homes and veterans hospitals and a variety of other places. And so through that, we were invited to come and work for Bread and Roses. And it was an unbelievable time because we got to work backstage and met a lot of those individuals, people like you mentioned, Chris Christopherson, Robin Williams. You're just a ton of people.
Joni Mitchell, Joan Baez. We got to interact with all of those individuals. What was it? Emmett.
Tell me how that, tell me how that felt as you were, doing your seminary work, and interacting with all these celebrities, but also, giving back to community and working on a cause.
I think the thing that was impactful for me is you see all of these individuals and you find out they're just regular people, and that many of them donated their time. People like Robin Williams just gave his time because it was something that they thought was important. And I think that was the key behind the whole Bread and Roses that Mimi Farina had in mind.
And as you're looking and you're backstage and looking at the impact on the audience, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I think, I think the audience, of course, you've got B.B. King, you've got all of these great musicians and stars that people know. And it was, I think for the majority of the people, it was just a fun concert, fun weekend. But I think for those that were performing, I think many of them were there because they thought this was something that was worthwhile.
And could make a difference.
And a quick note that it was in those years that I opened for some of the Windham Hill musicians at that coffee house you were talking about. And that's when I started also doing stand-up in different places around the Bay Area, and also met Robin Williams at a club one night. And he opened for me. And he opened for me. He just went before me, and it was hard to follow is what I'm saying.
Yes, that would be.
And do you have any other memories? We've got a minute or so here. If you've got something that really strikes you from your time.
Well, it was in seminary. It was an incredible time because we were part of the GTU, and so we had the opportunity to interact with people of various faith traditions, Catholics and Presbyterians and Baptist and all of that. But also there were still some tumultuous times. It was a time in 1978, if we remember, Harvey Milk was killed.
Yeah.
And that had a huge impact. And then the whole Jim Jones situation was exploding with taking his congregation people
and the cults
down to Guyana, and there was just a lot of both political activity with Jimmy Carter and all of that. So there was a whole mix, and of course in Berkeley, all of that was just like throwing gas on a fire.
Even Patty Hearst, I remember that was
Patty Hearst. Exactly.
Holy cow. Black Panthers, whom visited our campus at one point.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
okay. It was just sort of Berkeley was sort of like the magnet that drew, a lot of really interesting people.
Definitely a hotbed. Well, I'm looking forward to our next segment. I'd love to have you share about how you've seen the church change, and your feelings about how even attendance and people being part of the church and where are we going with the church. So love to have our next segment with how the church has changed and your reactions to that. And we'll be right back. You're listening to Connections Radio Show here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and our topic today is a journey of faith in community. And our co-host, Rick Bernardo, has brought a guest, Don Dewey. And tell us about Don, Rick.
Well, Don and I, with his current spouse, longtime spouse now, Susan, both went to Pacific School of Religion at the Graduate Theological Union. We spent some years, and we were just talking about, as we left the last segments, this was the late 70s and early 80s, and it was very formative, as we were just talking about, in the sense that it really started to wake me up, for instance, to what could ministry look like. I was never ordained. Don had his own journey with all of that. And by the way, he is a Disciples of Christ pastor. Right now, he's interim pastor at fcctorrance.org. That's First Christian Church of Torrance. So that's where he is right now. He's doing interim in ministry in his retirement, so-called. But Don Dewey and I had some incredibly formative years, and there's been decades of more formation after that. Hey, Don.
Good morning.
Good morning, Don. Thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciated hearing a little bit more about your history and getting a sense of Berkeley and your time there. A question that I've pondered lately is it just seems like the church has changed in many ways, but also people being part of the church. I grew up with you got dressed up to go to church on Sunday. The whole family went, and we'd sometimes go on Wednesday as well for family church night. There was things that youth groups would do, taking you all over the place. I know that still happens, but it just doesn't seem to be happening in the way that I remember it. And I was part of that whole 70s going to church, which we were celebrated sort of the Jesus people time. So with that context, can you just share with us how you see the trajectory of the church and our relationship to the church itself?
Sure. Growing up in the church, I have witnessed it kind of from the inside, a lot of the shifts and changes, as the church always has, I guess. But I think for many of us, some of the images that we have are really probably carryovers from the 50s. Yeah. The images of people dressed up, and going to, putting on their Sunday best and going and sitting in church in these very formal worship experiences. It was the 60s that came along and kind of unsettled everything for all across the board, politically, socially, and also within the church. And there began to be a dividing moment when the country was divided around the civil rights, the Vietnam War, and a whole variety of other things. And that found its way into the church, as all things do. And so the church at that time took a big dip, and it really began to be divided. And young people began to move away from that formal kind of structure of church, and we started to see emerging smaller, non-denominational churches. And as you mentioned, Lori, the sort of the Jesus movement came about, and we saw sort of a spur of churches starting to that weren't related to what been more traditional denominations, and out of that, I think that shot the church up for a while, but just for a short period. And then it began to decline. And out of that, the traditional churches, what we called mainline churches, have been suffering to decline, I think, since probably the late 60s. And in that time, between then and now, we've seen we saw a short growth of what we call mega churches. But even today now, even those are declining. I think another shift has taken place, and people in general are moving away from sort of that very structured kind of church, even in the informal way. I think that a lot of Gen X and millennials and others are not finding that form of church what works for them. They're looking for something that's more impactful. They become less hopeful about the future, and so concerned about what can we do right now to change our environment, change the way in which we relate as people to one another, and build new communities.
Are you seeing the church change to help support bringing new people in and attract the younger generation?
Well, I think that there's a lot of things that people are attempting to do. I don't know that all of them are always successful. I think that the young generations today, I think, are not as interested, I guess, in what I consider sort of the formal church. There's so much that now occupies their time and their interest because of all the social media that we have, the globalization that's available. They're just they can receive information or spiritual things without having to be committed to one place or one situation.
And what you were talking about, I remembered all the things that were percolating back when you and I started this journey. There were something like rock operas had never happened before. Jesus Christ Superstar. There was something called Jesus Freaks. There was folk services now. Folk music at what during church. There was jazz masses being done. And all kinds of new things that continued
and attracted.
Yeah. And attracted, and so to this day, a lot of churches are. I played for 5 years in a rock band for Spirit Garage, which was a Lutheran outreach ministry in part of the Twin Cities, and we did Beatles songs and Rolling Stones, and so those are working at some level, but the wider image is really different.
Yes, it is, and I think that there are. Like what you've just mentioned, I think that there are congregations or churches or communities that are attempting to reach those generations in the similar ways that you've just identified. Music is always a big draw, or the way in which the messages are presented. Again, but I see in what I consider sort of the formal churches, I see a continual still decline and more of a return to how churches have always sort of been in America.
Yeah.
And always sort of been, you were saying at another point when we were talking about this, like 50 to 100 people was sort of the average for a congregation.
If you look at the number of churches across the U.S., and I'm only focusing on Christian churches, but yes, they've always been relatively small communities, anywhere from 50 to 100. So anything above that was always seen as a large church. And it really wasn't until, the late 70s or even in the 80s when we started seeing what we call mega churches. These churches are churches that had, several thousand. But they were an anomaly and really a small segment. But the overall population of those attending in any way a Christian church has the number has not really changed that much.
One of the questions that I had in thinking about all this is that I do see people still committing to doing works. They go on mission trips still, and there's still a strong bent that way, which I love. I recall from the 60s and the civil rights movement, there was a lot of church involvement to support and move forward. And it became, one of the, an important structure that allowed us to come together and work together. I see these various ways that people are going out and doing mission work, but I don't feel the sense of the same sort of strong church backing that can bring, church members, congregations together on issues. Or am I just missing it? Tell me about that and your thoughts.
Well, one of the large movements that's been going on for quite a while now is led by Reverend William Barber, who is one of our disciple pastors, and he has been he started out with what's called Moral Mondays, and then developed what's referred to as the Poor People's Campaign, and he has. There are churches all across this country that are actively engaged in seeking reform for those that are disadvantaged in a variety of ways, economically, socially, politically, and a variety of other ways. And that has had a huge impact, I think, on a lot of mainline congregations that have re-engaged in sort of that new movement of making a difference in our community and our social structures.
And all about social justice, like what
Yes.
is fair. That's a very strong part of being human, is we know when something's unfair. And to act on that is one of the heart of all sacred scriptures for almost any religion. One really quick example of the framework inside of which we're working, I've come across Jay Baker a number of times in the Twin Cities. I don't think he lives there anymore, but he is the son of Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. Now, those parents ran this whole, not even beyond megachurch thing.
Media.
But it was a
almost.
media empire that then crashed and fell, and there's a whole story there. Jay, on the other hand, started Revolution Church, very grassroots oriented, very humanitarian and justice oriented. So it's a really interesting dichotomy there.
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing that as I think it sort of put the church in a kind of unique place, is that there are those within our faith community, our Christian faith community, that are trying to sort of recapture sort of the 50s kind of idea about church. And then there are the other half, or the other segment of our Christian community are recognizing that the area of social justice, equality, and peace, all of those kinds of things are what the church really needs to be focused on.
And I
think that sort of pitted them against one another in a sense, or fractured our Christian community.
And I deeply sense that you're committed to the social justice and the William Barber, Poor People's Campaign. Do you see a groundswelling? You said there's more churches getting involved, and there's a greater divide perhaps between the social justice churches that are committing to the Poor People's Campaign and versus some of the nationalist Christians that seem to be not moving in that direction.
Well, again, I think the nationalist Christian movement, I think, is a return to what I think is an image of the church that really never was, and I think we see that same kind of feeling across political lines. The divide that's there, as if somehow we're trying to recapture a moment in time when somehow there was some idealized thing going on. But the truth of it is, that the world has changed, not only through our social media, but basically the globalization of our world. And we find that both the political as well as the religious communities within this country have changed dramatically, and that we see much more pluralism now, even though there are those who want to say that this was a Christian nation and a return to that. That's never really been true. Yeah. And now I think with the growing number of other religious traditions within this country, I think that's we see a need for equality and social justice, as high values, and re-understanding what it means to live in community with one another.
And with that
versus exclusion, we look at inclusion as the new form of where faith needs to move.
And with that, I want to make sure that we talk more about that in our next segment. We'll talk more about how do we move towards that inclusion, and more about the nationalist Christian and how that's impacting our politics today. And that's with Don Dewey, and we'll be back in just a few moments. Stay with us. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and our topic today is a journey of faith in community. Rick Bernardo, our co-host, has brought a guest, Don Dewey.
Hi, Don. Good to see you again. And I just want to introduce you by saying that Don Dewey and his spouse Susan, actually, and I and many others were at Pacific School of Religion back in the late 70s and 80s. I'm dating myself, but for my social life, somebody has to. And he's had 35, 40, and counting many years of ministry, including being a regional co-pastor for the Pacific Southwest region of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And disciples.org, that's a good website to go to get some of the history of that denomination. And also we were just talking about the Poor People's Campaign, just poorpeoplescampaign.org. Go there. It's really an important movement about justice for people. So hi, Don. Welcome back.
Hi. Thank you.
Don, in our last segment, we were ending up talking about sort of the juxtaposition between the social justice and the Poor People's Campaign and the church's involvement and nationalist Christian movement that seems to be wanting to bring back a time that never was, but, you know, sort of a media memory of how it's been portrayed. And it just, there's tension, and there's tension that's going not only into the churches, but how it gets reflected out about our values and where we want to go with our country, which makes it a challenging time. I'd love to hear what first drew you to get back, to be part of the Poor People's Campaign. And then I'd like to continue our conversation between that juxtaposition between the Poor People's Campaign and the social justice and another force in our country right now that's been dividing us as a people and as Christians and as religion and all of that. So,
go
ahead.
I think our world has changed, and I think that we are seeing that here within this country that the growing diversity, and there are a couple of ways to respond to that. One is to respond negatively and feel that that has somehow taken away from our image of this country. The other way is to embrace that and to find that this is maybe more imagined the way the kingdom of God is meant to be. And I lean towards that way, that the diversity that we see within our communities in all its ways are maybe more reflective of the way the kingdom of God is meant to be. And I think that those are the places that we see where life has moved us into a place that we either need to recognize that this is the reality, or we regress, which is where I see a lot of those within the Christian nationalists regressing to some other idea that's not really the reality, addressing the reality that is.
I like the way you said that.
And you also, it seems, sort of are indicating that a lot of that is fear, and how people are expressing their fear.
Well, and there's a great deal of fear promoted all across this country at every level, not just religiously, but politically and socially. There's just a lot of fear out there, a fear of the unknown, fear of one another, fear of this, that continues to be a dividing piece, and it's used as a political weapon. I think as a way of addressing some of the real concerns that are underneath all of that, the economic disparity between rich and poor, the ways in which we deal with individuals that are different from ourselves. All of those contribute to this growing fear. And so the way in which we address that is that we make all of that seem as though it is, we need to find those to blame, rather than recognizing that there may be those that are what we call sort of our corporate managers or our political managers that are benefiting from this division, that are benefiting from the way things are, rather than us as a community recognizing that we might need to make some changes in order to bring more equity and more justice.
And it also seems to me that there's like a desire to impose rules, and these very strict rules somehow will make us all better. And they're arbitrary in some ways rules, and there's rules that work for them but not necessarily for others. It does not allow for diversity of thought. What's up with that? Is that just something that there's a comfort in rules? There's a comfort in making that demand of all of us obeying a certain set of rules that are created by a certain segment of the population?
Well, rules are important, but I think we have to ask ourselves who's making the rules and who benefits from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was sorry to interrupt you, Don. I was going to say there's money behind a lot of those that agenda. So a lot of the media, it's not one thing, but there is a lot of money behind certain movements going on, and not so much behind social justice movements that you and I have a heart for and a gut for. So I would ask people always to ask, check on your sources. I learned when you and I were in seminary together, people would come back from El Salvador saying, I was there, see this headline? That didn't happen. This other thing happened. I was there visiting, helping my friends there. So, I mean, people on the ground can report actually to you, but there's not a lot of money to fund that. But there is not always accurate reporting about any of this, and there's a lot of money about the misinformation that has to do with political power.
Sure. It often is about power and control and money.
But what's the unfortunate victim in all of this is truth. And I know, we can have lots of different debates about what truth is, but there are things that are like verifiable.
Yeah.
And when things aren't, verified and we're making up to create the emotional excitement, the adrenaline, the fighting spirit, it's just sad to me. It's sad to me that there are individuals that love Trump because he seems to have more energy and not listening to what he's saying. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, nor is it verifiable. It's verifiably untrue. And yet there's this movement behind him and that I have a hard time understanding.
Yeah.
You're not the only one.
You and I, Don, touched on talking when we weren't on the air here. There's a documentary called Bad Faith about this history of this movement to instill fear in people. Goes back to the 60s and before that with white supremacy as part of a well-executed plan cloaked as religion. And everybody needs to know that history so they can see and dismantle it and not be frozen in our tracks.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a co-opting at some point.
Co-opting.
And that's the part that I'm intrigued with. How did it get co-opted?
There was some intentionality around that within the event at that time, the evangelicals, as well as a certain segment of our Republican Party, saw an opportunity to expand their voting possibilities, and so began to identify with and support those things that were being lifted up as issues, what we call wedge issues, and chose to support those within the more conservative part of our Christian faith community, and that marriage or that wedding continue to grow to where we see that those within the conservative community have sort of reshifted what they used to consider were their highest values, family values, and all of those kinds of things. We no longer see that, and that has been exchanged for political power. And I think that we see that with someone like Donald Trump and others who talk the words, but have no connection whatsoever.
And I have to believe that's part of what's turning off young people to churches. Is it, unfortunately, that view of what Christianity is dominating, at least the media, it feels like. And that's sad.
There's millions of people now totally turned off of any idea of church, any idea of religion, and see it all as crowd control, all as fake, all as disingenuous, and nothing to do with the real heart of community and fairness that it really has as its soul. So that's sad, Don, for people like you doing work for decades now, and all of our friends.
I do.
Well,
Go ahead.
I think that the church, the conservative church, and that group, if you want to say they've done something, what they have done is that they have taken advantage in many ways of the social media, and they have been much more well organized than I would say those on the more conservative, because our tendency has been to just to be generous, to be caring, to be embracing, to be loving. We didn't have a big plan to somehow convert the world, which is different from the other side, which I think did have a plan to convert the world in their way, and thus has had an advantage. And so you're right. What they see on television, or what they experience, and what gets the most media attention is this much more conservative, evangelical, and political right
I would say
understanding of the church. And thus, you're right, younger people see that as the whole church.
Right. And it's perverted. It's a perverted image.
It's it is a distorted view, yes.
I know we only have a couple minutes, but if you were to encourage us to think about moving forward, what this could look like, what kind of hope that we can set our sails on, what would that look like?
Well, again, I think that what the value that church has is creating hopeful community. And I think that a lot of our younger people have lost sort of hope in the political system, the religious system, and in their future. And so I think that the gift that the church can bring is to, again, bring people together, recognizing that we are a diversity, but that is a good thing. That is the way in which the kingdom of God is meant to be. And the church I'm serving right now, is going through what we call a process of open and affirming. And that means that we are explicitly welcoming those within our LGBTQ plus community, but with intentionality to be those who embrace diversity in every form. And we're finding that has recaptured a sense of joy and welcome, and a new sense about what it means to be church.
It's wonderful.
Well, thank you, Don, for spending time with us today as you share about your journey with both your faith and your community, and providing maybe a roadmap for us to think about in terms of living our faith through church, and what could that mean for us.
And go to disciples.org about his denomination, and the poorpeoplescampaign.org website. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Don. And you've been listening to AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. And this is Connections Radio Show, and we look forward to having you join us next week for our next episode of Connections Radio Show.